the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, Ender's Game meets Mean Girls meets Pokemon Go, and Tinker returns. Plus, we continue our ongoing audiobook serialization of Timothy Zahn's Cobra. All right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour. It's a pleasure to have you along. I am Baen Associate Editor and your podcast host, David Afsharirad. This week, we bring you Josh Hazlet's conversation with Sean Patrick Hazlet and the contributors to Weird World War IV. Now, savvy listeners may be asking themselves, hey, did we have World War III and nobody told me? Well, Weird World War IV is the companion volume to a book we bought out sometime back called, you guessed it, Weird World War III. In this latest anthology, that is Weird World War IV, science fiction, fantasy, and horror authors ask themselves what the war after the next might be like, with surprising and exciting results, which you'll hear about in just a moment. But first, the news. The April hardcovers are in. Let's take a look. First up, Into the Real by John Ringo and Lydia Scherer. Lynn Raven may be the boss master of Warmonger 2050 with her online persona of Larry the Snake. But when the CEO of Tsunami Entertainment personally asks her, as a favor, to beta test a new augmented reality game, she has to face her greatest fear, going outside and dealing with, well, people. As she becomes more immersed in the game, the stakes rise, and so do the obstacles. Strife between teammates, a ruthless rival team, and these strange glitches that make it seem like the game algorithm, or maybe game AI, has it in for her. Now she has to face a new fear. Is she willing to step into the real to win the future she's always wanted? And Tinker returns in Harbinger by Win Spencer. Single-handedly, she'd managed to accidentally change her species, rip a hole in the fabric of reality, kidnap a major USA city, fall off the planet, crash a spaceship into Turtle Creek, kill a dragon, but now Tinker faces her most dangerous challenge yet. The war against the Oni heats to a flashpoint even as Tinker learns that the enemy has a dangerous new weapon, the Nocta. What's more, the Stone Clan has sent its most famous warlords, the Harbingers, to take control of the Allied war effort. Are these elves friends or foes? Tinker's newfound baby siblings are up for grabs. The babies, though, are wood sprites and aren't going to take things lying down. Team Mischief, go! That's Into the Real by John Ringo and Lydia Scherer, and Harbinger by Win Spencer, out now in hardcover. And stay tuned to the Baen Free Radio Hour. We'll be featuring both books on upcoming podcasts. This month marks the long-awaited return of Tinker in Harbinger. To celebrate, we're offering discounts on all Win Spencer backlist titles. From past entries in the Elf Home series to standalone novels, there's something for everyone. From now until the end of April, get $1 off all Win Spencer ebook backlist titles. And don't forget to pick up the latest entry in the Elf Home series, Harbinger, while you're at it. Sale ends April 30th, 2022, and these discounts are good wherever Baen ebooks are sold. And that's it for the news.
All right, welcome to the interview portion of the Baen Free Radio Hour. I am Josh Hayes, your host, and today we have Sean Hazlet, T.C. McCarthy, Michael Z. Williamson, and Laird Barron. We're talking about Weird World War IV, and I dare you to say it 3 times real fast. It's like I guarantee you won't. Yeah, I was like trying before and didn't work out. So we're going to talk about everybody's stories. They're fantastic. Michael's was hilarious. Laird's was very creepy, and TC, my spine tingled just a little bit. It was amazing. So I appreciated all the stories and I love them. And here pretty soon we'll talk about each and every one of them. Before then, though, Sean, you're kind of the creator of this series, the Weird World War series. So can you talk about this 4th volume and kind of what are your thoughts behind it?
Yeah. So interestingly, it's actually the 2nd volume. So the first volume was Weird World War III. That was meant to be an alternate history / alternate futures of a conflict between the U.S. and Soviet Union, generally without nuclear weapons. And to kind of simplify things, think Stephen King meets Tom Clancy. That was kind of the log line for that.
Gotcha.
This version. So I went back to Baen and I actually pitched Weird World War I and Weird World War II, and for good reason. The publisher said a lot of that's been overdone and it might not necessarily be differentiated enough in the marketplace. And I think those are all fair points. At some point, though, I definitely want to do those too. Yeah. So what they proposed instead was, how about Weird World War IV? And I'm like, well, let me think about it. And then the first thing that hits everybody's mind is Einstein's famous quote about I don't know what weapons World War III will be fought with, but I do know World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones or rocks. Right? There's a lot of actually misquotations there, but I cover that in my
or ink.
So the conceit behind this particular volume is, what does the war beyond the next war look like? And there's a lot fewer constraints than there was in the first anthology. So it doesn't have to be with Soviets. It doesn't have to be with anybody in particular. The only thing that has to be true or the things that have to be true are, number one, there has to have been a Third World War. And then number two, there has to be a Fourth World War. And then number three, the Fourth World War has to have some sort of weird element that's incorporated into that. And the other thing that's worth noting is, I generally don't try to seek, strong ideological content, but I would say there's 4 or 5 stories that, have a thread of that on both sides. Right. So, Nick, I tried to get Nick on this call, but he's got other commitments today, but Nick Mamatas has a story that's, full communism in space. Right. Then there's, Torgerson's story, which is, mentioned in the Publisher's Weekly Review. I'm not going to say much on it here. And then there's a kind of another story that has kind of an anti-Trump vein, which is kind of Weston Oak's story. And then you have Michael Z. Williamson's story, which is, let's just say there's stuff to offend every single party here. So it'll be interesting to see how it works. I'm actually surprised that Publishers Weekly kind of actually acknowledged that. And then that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to be the guy who can have like a Brad Torgerson and a Nick Mamatas in the same volume. Right. It's all about ideas. And, if you don't like a particular story, you can move on. And if you do, then anyway, I just want to put that out there, when we start, so that that's kind of what we're solving for. But in terms of, I don't want to go too much into TC, Laird, and Mike's stories, but they all are very different in many ways. I know Laird, his story and his character in his story, and hopefully he'll say more about it, is like a character that runs through all of his, or many of his short stories. A very, very I don't want to say famous, but I should say famous character, and he'll say more about it. TC's is just creepy.
Yeah.
So is Laird's actually, but they're creepy in different ways. And then Mike does a lot of poking, and he takes current sociological trends and takes them to extremes to relatively satisfying comedic effect. So with that, Josh, I'll send it back to you.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you said, that you point out the collective, the political differences in some of the stories, right? And that you're able to collect from both sides. And I think that's great that you can have an anthology that takes those stories and gives them out and lets the reader decide and lets the reader enjoy, but also the content of the stories is wildly different too. Just in the three that we have here today, you have funny, you have very creepy, and you also have very wild / creepy. And to have those all in one anthology, it's not like everybody is doing the same story over and over and over again. It's very different, and that I think that really makes a really good anthology to have a
And
really
to give you a sense of the breadth of ideas and even formats. So John Langan has a story at the end that's a play. It's like a post-apocalyptic Arthurian play.
Nice.
So it gives you, like, there's a lot of creativity in this volume, because sometimes when you put down somewhat odd constraints that I had, it forces people to get really creative.
Well, let's talk about one of those. TC, we'll start with yours. The beginning of your story really kind of starts out kind of fun, almost kind of enjoyable, and then it very, very quickly takes a left turn to Albuquerque, if you will. Can you talk about a little bit about what your idea was for the story, and then we'll go from there?
Yeah. So I have to kind of admit to something here. I had forgotten that I agreed to do the anthology for Sean. And so he reminded me, and there wasn't much time. So I sat down and in a few days just worked, not nonstop, but any free time I had was dedicated to writing this story. And I drew from a couple of different places. First of all, I ignored the rule, or I ignored the premise that there's a fourth world war. This one takes place after the Third World War, and kind of at what would be the beginning of the Fourth World War. And so apologies, Sean, I broke your rule. But it worked. Good. Okay. Yeah. And I remember, I don't remember much about my father, but I remember he was a civil rights attorney working for the Highway Department, Federal Highway Administration. And one of the things he used to talk about, he used to travel to Hopi reservations, Navajo reservations, to try and get them to join the work crews for the interstate highways, to maintain them and stuff. And they used to hate him coming because he was a government guy. And so he used to tell me how, their attitude was, oh, great, here's the government again to help us.
That sounds like my wife, who's Choctaw.
Yeah. So there's a deep distrust of the federal government, and rightfully so. One can certainly understand given their history. So I kind of wove that in, and also I enjoy, Sean and I talk quite frequently about paranormal stuff, and I really enjoy, I'd say as a hobby, but also kind of as a student, enjoy digging into ghost stories and prophecy and all sorts of different areas. And so one of the things that I've always been fascinated by is this Hopi prophecy of blue Kachina and what it could mean. And so that was kind of the starting point, was fusing that prophecy with some of the stories my father had told me about his experience with Hopi Indians.
Can you explain, just kind of talk about what that prophecy is?
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, they have a prophecy about something called the blue Kachina, which is supposedly a blue star that will show up and kind of, as a warning that the world is about to end. So it's a prophecy about the apocalypse. And that's it in a nutshell. It's been a while since I've looked at it. I'm trying to remember details, but they may come to me as we talk.
Well, I like the going into kind of the exploration aspect of your story, or the guys going down on the asteroid and kind of looking around it, and then it quickly becomes a mystery of what happened to everybody, and then it kind of turns into almost like a horror-esque, like not a zombie per se, but of this creature, unknown something that has started to kill everybody, and now they're wanting to get out of here, and through no fault of their own, stuff happens, and then the story takes a drastic turn, and very kind of a really gory turn at the very end. Is that vision of how that story ends kind of concurrent with your vision of the way you see the prophecy calling about the end of the world?
No, absolutely not. As a matter of fact, I kind of wanted to deviate from that because I wasn't sure. Whenever I sit down and try and think of a short story idea, I always imagine that everybody's written about the ideas that I come up with.
Yeah.
And so, my first kind of thought once I settled on the concept was, all right, I need to now get away from standard interpretations of what the blue kachina is and come up with some sort of invention that hopefully, fingers crossed, nobody else has really kind of written about. I'm sure somewhere somebody in the past has come very close to my plot line, but I certainly couldn't think of anybody who had off the top of my head.
One of the things I really like about short stories is the ability to do kind of an ambiguous ending, and you really, I mean, it's concrete what happens to the characters in the story, but outside of that, the reader is kind of left to
what happens next.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Is that, did you set that up purposefully, or?
Oh yeah. I wanted an ended ending, so to speak, in terms of the kinds of short stories that I enjoy the most are where you have a firm grasp of what's happened, the challenges that your protagonist has faced, and whether or not he or she has overcome those challenges. But then the stories that really stick with me are the ones that remind the reader that there's also a bigger context, and that those events that transpire in that little capsule of a short story are going to have a major impact on the rest of the world, and give them just enough kind of information so that he or she can think about it and kind of put down the story and spend a lot of time thinking about, oh my gosh, what would happen if?
And is this connected to any of the other writing you've done?
No, this is purely separate and independent.
Before we move on, just to kind of give you a little stage time here, what are you working on right now? Are you working on anything that's gonna?
So I've got 2 books out right now with Baen, and one of them just went to from trade paperback to mass market paperback. It's a Far Future space opera series. The first book was Tiger Burning, and the second book is Tiger Bright, and it's essentially an alien invasion, but then the aliens left Earth mysteriously, and why they left Earth is very concerning to those in the know on Earth, and what it means for the future. And so the stories take place in a setting where mankind knows, humans know that in 100 years something really awful is going to happen, and they've only got that much time to get ready.
Interesting. Very cool. Okay, let's talk about Michael's story then while we're going around the room here. Triplicate is hilarious, and it's I think it's probably one of the only stories that I've read that maintains a kind of tongue-in-cheek vibe throughout the entire narrative. Like some stories maybe have 1 or 2 kind of aha, I see what you did there references, but this story is really chock full of them. Can you talk about that a little bit?
It's a concept I had years back before I actually started getting published, and I had a really good outline, and I had certainly a considerable amount of content there, but it wasn't nearly at the level it was. I handed it over to Freddie, and he sort of ran with it, and I was basically hanging onto the reins for the ride and periodically going, hold on, let me catch up here, and then editing what he contributed. And yeah, I mean, it's intended to mock everything. People talk about how you and others have said some of it is over the top ridiculous, but then so was Demolition Man when it first hit the screen.
True,
and
very true. Well, and that's actually a really cool comparison, because you have the three seashells, which nobody knows anything about, and then every time he curses, he gets the fine, and
right.
I mean, you've done the social credit thing, which I thought was hilarious, but then just the idea of having a world war through paperwork was hilarious to me.
The scene with the cranes, the whooping cranes shutting the flight line down.
Yeah.
So that actually happened. That's a real world incident.
Nice.
Flight line during an exercise was shut down because an endangered whooping crane was.
You mean the animal persons?
Animal persons, yes. Yes. Animal persons, yes.
Well, I think it was interesting because, like I said, the entire story is kind of filled with these knocks and jabs at kind of present day just wokeness, if you mind the expression. And like you said, there's other points of view in the anthology, but you definitely read this and you definitely will see the jabs at I mean, the opening email that he sends, and then the PS after. I knew after that I was sold for this run.
Well, it also mocks military bureaucracy too. Like that's a huge portion of it. I mean, especially if you've spent any time in the military, it's like
we both did, and then Freddie spent a bunch of time working with other agencies. State Department, Interior, EPA, and you can see all that.
It's interesting because I did some time in the Air Force, and then I did about 12 years as a cop. And the line "you can't fight in this is a war teleconference" I fell out. Like, that was amazing. You have warriors talking about these things, and they're arguing back and forth, and then
and that was straight out of Dr. Strangelove.
Yes,
you can't fight in here. This is the war room. Yeah,
it definitely has a very Dr. Strangelove feel to it, for sure.
Yeah.
How many did you go in? I know that you had a co-author as well for this story, but did you go in with certain things in mind in terms of the tongue-in-cheek nature of the narrative that you wanted to put in and then fit the story around that?
I mean, the story basically wrote itself once you have this is a war, and the war is being fought literally with paperwork.
Yeah.
They're literally flying in a transport aircraft, cargo aircraft, full of documents to fight this war. So, from that, you obviously get RSIs, repetitive stress injuries, you get people running out of ink, you get, and then I don't drink coffee, but Freddie does. And it's, oh my God, we're out of coffee. It's like, that's...
the fill out this form. What's this form for? To get more forms was amazing. Because every one of those things, they seem ridiculous, but a lot of the running jokes that you have in there, they're true. Like, the nature of the idea is true. Like
I enlisted in '85, and they were just starting to computerize stuff, and they had all these obviously dot matrix printed forms that specified at the bottom computer generated. And then engineer units, so we'd go over to supply our particular supply sub-element, and we'd grab a box of screws and some wire connectors and go fix something. And they decided, well, this was being wasteful, and some of it was winding up being used for side jobs in the civilian world, so you had to have either a work order or a job order specifying the number of screws you needed. So we'd write down we need a box, and then it was tractor feed paper, self-carbon, the stuff that does its self-imprinting for copies. It was 3 thick. It would print up one, prints the next 2 pages, and then print up a third blank page. So they'd have to tear it off and then manually crank it back and waste a page every time they printed out an invoice. So my career started with that and got to.
And isn't it interesting that for 30 years, all government agencies, military and police included, have been going paperless? And I think that the funny thing for that is that the more that we go paperless, the more paperwork they generate.
My wife's IT forensics, and the hilarious thing for both of us is the number of people who don't realize that their texts, emails, and IMs are logged. It can be recovered. Whatever you said can be recovered.
Right. Well, like I said it before, I think the interesting thing about your story is that there are several parts that people will read and go, this just can't happen. But the people in the know that have been there will read it and laugh at it because it's funny, but also laugh at it because it's true.
I've had that with reviews for most of my work. Oh, this is so ridiculous, that would never happen. And then 6 months later, it's in the news. Or, for the weapons, civilians were very horrified by the training process I had. It was ridiculously brutal. And a couple of SEALs and a couple of Special Forces guys said, so you dialed that down for the civilians, didn't you? It's like, yeah.
So what do you have on the production queue right now?
So I
because you just had what was the book you just had come out?
That was Now This Is Them.
Yes.
Second time travel. Yeah.
Yeah.
I am working on the third one. I've got and it suddenly got a lot more complicated, which is really cool, but will mean more work. I'm doing a Black Tide Rising with Ringo. I've got 2 of my own on spec on the back burner, and for a while I've been contracted for a 4th Ripple Creek, which will have its own, not quite that level of snark, but we'll have some snark. But I'm tied up dealing with kids. A friend of mine died last year with no will, although we got that sorted out. And combination hoarder and collector. So after we've thrown out literally 16 roll-off dumpsters of trash from 2 houses, there's tens of thousands of anime discs, autographed sci-fi books, exotic firearms that were loaned to the Fort Harrison Museum, stuff like that. We're trying to sort through for his family and get sold. That's been taking up several hours a week.
Well, and you've done a number of anthologies also where
yes.
you've kind of, and I've actually been in one of your anthologies, Battle Luna, but it nice to be on, is it always nice to be on the end where you don't have to do the curating and you could just write a single story and send it in?
Yes, but on the other hand, it's very rewarding to edit and put a project together, especially the Resistance, where we had a unified timeline and all the stories followed both the sequentially and interspersed. I'm not doing that again, though. That was a lot.
Anthologies are tough for sure. Well, Laird, let's talk about your story, the Big Whimper. Sean mentioned earlier that you've kind of got a recurring character in Rex and the main character story, and the format of your story was interesting. The way it starts out and then goes into narrative and then goes back to kind of a system type readout deal. Tell us about the kind of the origin of this story and your reoccurring character, Rex.
Oh, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be on with you, gentlemen.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Rex has been I've written probably 5 or 6 stories about Rex at this point, and he has appeared in multiple stories over the years. That's sort of something I've been playing with, is all my characters are rapidly living and dead within the context are becoming recurring characters. I've been playing with the idea of time being everything occurring simultaneously, essentially. And this story sort of plays with that that's sort of the framework of the story, or at least the underpinnings of it, that the readout, it's a quantum signal and it's occurring before, after, and during the events of the story. And to TC's point, this is kind of, I don't think I broke the rule Sean had, but it's certainly more of an aftermath of World War IV and sort of the consequences, or at least, if not the consequences, the mental, the psychological and physical landscape of what existence is going to be like after that. But Rex is sort of an eternal, if not a champion, he's sort of an eternal recurrence. I killed him off in almost every story I've ever written about him, and he wakes up again and has to sort of come to terms with that he is reliving, various moments of reality, and they're happening simultaneously. There's a bifurcation of his personality. He was, especially bred and trained war canine, that something that probably is within our grasp to create at this point, but that he had somehow been fused with various levels of technology. His consciousness had been fused with various levels of technology over the centuries, culminating in what the science fiction stories I've written about him, the far future stories, where he's almost has a split super consciousness. There's the canine consciousness, which would be almost equivalent of a human intelligence, and this sort of computer that exists almost in another plane of reality. But unfortunately, there's been damage done to him, and so it's almost a split personality, and he sort of battles for control of his soul, as it were.
The interesting nature of an schizophrenic, insane war dog with capabilities to destroy a world is a really interesting dynamic to play with. And you had a lot of good imagery, I think, in your story, starting out kind of where he's talking to the other entity, but you don't kind of give explanation to that. It just kind of happens, and then the meeting of the princess and that, I love that visual and that whole scene, that whole interaction that happens there. Can you talk about kind of the creation of these different levels of creatures and kind of almost societies that you've apparently grown up after this war? Is that something that also carries on in your other works, or was it something you just created for this story?
No, I've mentioned it actually in a couple of the other stories that are specifically about Rex, as opposed to Rex appearing as a side character. It's very similar setup. It's far in the future, and basically humanity has been wiped out, except possibly for the reemergence of some kind of proto Homo sapiens type creature. And one of the things I've sort of fascinates me is that Rex obviously was bred and designed and bred to wage war, but on behalf of humanity, as a offensive machinery, but also as a protector. The best defense is a good offense. But now that he's left to his own devices and mad, insane, and damaged, all these, a sentient nuclear weapon with dementia. It's probably not. It might be kind of frightening. But would, in some of the stories I've written about him, this one kind of sort of touches on it, but not so directly. It's just that is mankind even worth saving anymore? His directive doesn't even apply. We've come to this because of ourselves. Because of human activity. Is the world better off without us? And I don't directly answer that question. Rex, but he's very conflicted about it. He explores the possibilities. But the idea of like super insects or super animal species, I played with that in the past. But a lot of this is just me. When I write these Rex stories, they are part of my overarching universe that I've created. But this is where my influence is quite blatantly and ecstatically. I loved Fred Saberhagen's Berserker stuff. The idea of the world destroying entities that can be boiled down to like a humanoid figure. Raj Zelazny touched on that. There was Road Marks. There was a creature that was actually in the physiology of a human being, but was actually a doomsday device that had been deactivated and abandoned on Earth. And so I've always liked the idea of the doomsday device distilled down to a dog or a person or a small innocuous object. Doctor Who, the whole Dalek, they look like vacuum cleaners, with a suction attachment, and yet they're these dreadnoughts, world annihilating, universe annihilating dreadnoughts. And so there's a lot of influence. I get to play with all my I was a big Heinlein fan when I was growing up. Arthur C. Clarke, Clifford D. Simic, and these overtly science fiction stories that feature Rex are simply my chance to kind of play with that, to sort of pay it back, as it were.
Well, and you kind of, it's really cool to have that kind of dichotomy of this is a dog. It's like you even say in the story, it's man's best friend, and most people think dogs and cuddly and playful, and you even have some references that are dog, like legitimately dog like taking a nap and putting my snout under my tail and not doing anything else, and we can all kind of visualize that, but then you have that juxtaposed against the world ender and everything that happens at the end of the story, and it's a really interesting take, I think, on that kind of character. So with your connected stories and the time as a ring aspect of everything, do you have, I mean, as far as I know, these are connected short stories. Do you have plans on expanding this into kind of a novel universe, or what are your thoughts on that?
Actually, I talked to a publisher a few years ago about doing a trilogy and basically taking this story and melding it with some of the other stories I've written about Rex and turning it into almost like a mosaic novel. And so that could happen. I'm also working on a dark fantasy science fiction setting. So it would be kind of in the classic vein of like Leiber and Vance and Zelazny, where it's the science fiction purist would clutch their pearls because it's not really science fiction, and the fantasists are like, but you've got science fiction in my fantasy, and I've been messing with that, and Rex and a lot of the characters, actually, including the villains, appear throughout that, and I'm working on a novel kind of based on that, but it's set definitely in this quasi Dark Ages fairy tale North American setting. So we'll see how that goes.
Is that the only thing you're working on now, or do you have any other projects that you're?
Well, just finished at least the first arc of a crime series, this trilogy. It's called Blood Standard was the first one. The most recent one is Worse Angels. I'm working on this dark fantasy science fiction novel horror. It's kind of a combination of those elements. Lots of short fiction. I'm getting ready to turn in a contemporary horror collection to my agent. I just have to work on a couple elements of it. And that one's crime, horror, mystery, thriller, all sort of bolted into horror. And so that'll get turned in soon. And I'm working on another collection, which is pretty close to being done, which is a dark fantasy collection, which is a mix of horror and science fiction and high fantasy in the vein of Karl Edward Wagner and like I said, Leiber and Zelazny and those guys. I'm kind of at this stage in my career where I feel like I'm able to take all the influences that I grew up with. I was raised in the wilderness up in Alaska. Spent a good section, about 10 years of my life. My dad was in the Marine Corps, and when he came back, when I was about 7, 8 years old, he decided that moving us off to the wilderness, the outback of Alaska, was something he wanted to do. And so that's where we were, and we didn't have much outlet. We were, one-room cabin, root cellar, no electricity. So I did a lot of reading, and luckily my mom, she liked everything from Barbara Cartland to Louis L'Amour to Robert Heinlein, and I was able to write. But I really owe a lot of getting through my early years to all these classic science fiction authors and mystery and crime authors. And so I feel like I'm at a point in my career now, after having been in publishing for about 22, 23 years, that I can just I've established myself, my identity, and now I'm at a stage where I'm playing in the sandboxes of the people who influence me.
Oh, that's very cool. I've got a question that kind of teeters to the writers that may be watching the podcast, and this is for everybody, and we can kind of go around the room and maybe talk about it. But the differences between novel writing and short stories are very, very. I mean, you still have to have plot, you still have to have good characters, but keeping a short story really well contained and not just a chunk of a bigger work is kind of challenging, I think, for most authors. Maybe we'll start with Sean as kind of the editor of this, and having gone through it a lot of short stories from the editorial side. What do you look at as the biggest challenges for writing and finishing a good, wholly contained short story?
So I would say I would go back to kind of Edgar Allan Poe, right? And he always said that a short story should have a singular effect, achieve a singular effect. Now, that's definitely, for somebody who's a little bit less experienced, that's a good thing to aim for. As writers become better, I think the best writers are able to have that thread, but they're also able to layer other things above and below that at the subconscious level that are mutually reinforcing, right? That help with that central theme. What I've also seen is that, there's obviously lots of different types of writers, but there are some writers who do really well when you give them very tight constraints. Like, it's almost as if by constraining them, you unlock their creativity. So, if you're a new writer and you're stuck, this might not work for everybody, but if you constrain yourself to certain aspects that you want to achieve in the story, you might end up writing something better. For me, for myself, I tend to write better stories when I have certain constraints. Now, there's stuff that I don't think I'm capable of writing. Like, if somebody said, write me an optimistic hope punk like story, I wouldn't even try.
Right.
I'm just not, constrained to do that. The other thing too that I noticed is when you put out these constraints, people will surprise you. Like, I told you the 3 degrees of freedom that each of these stories had, and you get wildly different results, and they're all really good. And then the last piece is just don't be afraid to write about things that you might think are taboo or difficult to stomach, because those are the things that get people talking. Will everybody like it? No.
Right.
But at the end of the day, that's where you see true genius, where people go where everybody else is not necessarily going. So I don't know if that's helpful, but
definitely
I would look at it.
TC, do you have thoughts on that, on the nature of short stories, and maybe some challenges between novels and short stories, or for you personally?
Yeah, I so I wrote kind of started writing when I was really, really young, and I can kind of relate to the story of living in Alaska in a cabin with only books to read, because which is a great story, by the way. And my mom, we were living in the Bay Area for a period of time, for almost 10 years. And my mom got rid of our TV. It was the 70s, it was California. And, it was kind of a different time back then, and got rid of our TV. And what that did was force me to start reading, just like what was described earlier, anything and everything, just to kill time. And so, along the way, I started writing, and I was told you need to start with short stories, and then eventually, try a novel. So that's what I did. And short story after short story after short story. This is before the internet, so I'd go to the library and get the most recent edition of, I forgot what it was called now, Publishers something. That had the addresses for the magazines,
the big thick one. That
Writers Market.
There you go. Yeah.
And I'd send them out, and a few months later, I'd get the rejection. And eventually, after doing that for years, I convinced myself I couldn't write. And then one day I started again. And instead of writing a short story, I wrote a novel. And for me, it was as if the light bulb went on and a door opened. And I realized at the end of that process, after I had gotten an agent and gotten my first book published, I realized that, I can't remember if Sean just said this, but for me, I'm speaking personally, not for anybody else. I find it much more difficult to write short stories. I'm really not built for short stories. I like to be able to go out in several different directions and explore multiple veins in depth, and have lots of different things going on. Not to say that you can't do that in a short story. I can't.
Wow.
It's just not in me per se. So now, obviously, I can write short stories. I'm in Sean's anthology. I've published short stories elsewhere, but it takes a lot more work for me. I feel like, to get a story that's palatable for an audience. The interesting thing about this experience is what I already said, which was I forgot, and I had a short time span to write this thing. And I think this is one of the better stories I've ever written. So maybe because I tend to over complexify things,
Yeah.
Maybe that's the answer for me, is just to say I'm going to write this in 2 or 3 days and that's it, and walk away. I don't know. But it's definitely, for me, easier to write a novel than it is a short story.
Yeah. I'm right there with you. I started do kind of the same thing you did, where writing short stories and not getting anywhere, and then starting writing novels. And now I've written several short stories now, but I think after flexing my muscles with the novels and being able to do what you're saying, like go out and explore things, and then now I'm just training other muscles to write the short stories and becoming a better writer, I think, because of it. Michael, what are your thoughts on writing short stories? Your novels are particularly long, and it's interesting when I see authors that write really long novels, but then are also able to come up and present short stories that are passable as whole short stories and not simple chunks.
Similar to TC, I was advised by Stephen Barnes to write short stories and get them published in the magazines and get known. And I kept getting rejections. And I'd already finished Freehold, and trying to get noticed. And finally, I was complaining about the rejection letters were, "Thank you for submitting such and such. Alas, it doesn't work for us." Like, what's with the fake drama? Just you didn't like it. It doesn't work for us. And I was on Baen's forum, and Jim said, "Well, maybe they're being alliterative. Alack, alas, alay." He did like an entire paragraph of that. And he says, "That said, send me one single chapter of something you're working on. I'll take a look at it." And 9 months later, we bought the novel.
Nice.
I mean, novels and short stories are different, because in a short story you have to have the character, the plot, and the setting all condensed into a few thousand words. You can't really do world building. That was part of the problem I was having. I was trying to do world building in short stories. It has to be assumed. It has to be presented in such a way that the reader can grasp it innately without having to have a lengthy discourse. So learn, and that came. I got all that sorted out when John Ringo asked me for a story for Citizens, his anthology, and I had one that I thought would work, and I actually went back and gutted 2/3 of it, where I was trying to do world building, condensed it down, rewrote it, and turned it into a cohesive whole. So I can do short stories. Novels are longer, but they're intellectually easier. You just write and write and write and write and write. What are you going to say? And then there's no, if it takes another 10,000 words, it takes 10,000 words. Of course, you have to make it interesting. It has to be exciting, but but you're not limited by real estate.
Well, Laird, you've already presented your case for short stories, and almost kind of established yourself as a short story writer, as a in your area. Can you think of a challenge that maybe you've looked at over the career of writing these that you would maybe give as a tip to anybody looking to start writing short fiction?
Well, I'm not really sure about that, because it all comes back to, especially listening to the other authors on here talking about their perspective. My belief is that there are objective realities about writing and the different modes of writing, or art in general. And if there's not objective reality, there's certainly a consensus opinion about how things work. But I will say this, that in a lot of ways, talking about whether short stories are easier than novels or vice versa, is a lot like saying, well, if you're of a certain height and you got legs like tree trunks versus you're long, angular, and skinny, you might want to be a marathon runner or a sprinter. If you talk to somebody with thick legs and a powerful, broad hips, and narrow waist, wide shoulders, they're going to like sprinting. They're going to say, well, hell, that's easy. It's way easier than like jogging for 26 miles. And the marathon runner's going to be like, I don't even get warmed up for the first 8 miles.
Yeah.
So, and so there are best practices. There are things that I think that points of commonality. You eventually have to put your ass in the seat. You eventually have to get your quill out, or your iPad, or whatever it is you use, or your secretary takes diction, and you have to create. But what you're good at may not, my advice necessarily isn't going to apply to you. But that said, if all things are equal, if you sort of look at kind of distill things, I do think short fiction is much more complex, in the sense that what's easier, broad strokes painting, or cramped over something and trying to get minute, finite detail for hours on end, this little postage stamp, piece of art that you're drawing. And I think if you have equal facility in the the big canvas stuff or the fine work, I think it would become quite apparent that the fine detail work probably requires more brush strokes, more concentrated effort. Trying to do anything slowly and carefully is always going to be, like say physically, trying to lift weight really, really slowly will cause, in a very short period of time, your body to start shaking. Your nervous system will start overloading, where you can pump out at a light reps, maybe for 20 minutes straight. And so I do feel like short fiction for me is far more complex, because there's another factor. This is just simple physics: beginning, middle, end. And let's say you write a lot of short stories. Let's say you have a collection you're putting together. You're going to write 12. That's 12 beginnings, 12 middles, 12 ends, and each one, to the worthies who have preceded me in this conversation, they have to be satisfying.
Right.
You're not just vomiting out, okay, well, here's this vignette. No. You're trying to put together novels in miniature. And I have found that for me, it's far easier to get up on step, to shift into a gear, get the boat up on step, and to go for great distances with an idea and develop the idea, and then come back and during editing, do fine work, which we have to do no matter what type of writing you're doing. But 12 beginnings, 12 middles, 12 ends, and they need to be satisfying. And for me, I try to lock them together in not necessarily a mosaic, but some kind of ramifying theme in the collection. I find that to be just a lot more, if you just break down the elements that it takes to create a piece of art, far more, I won't say tedious, but there's far more labor, physical labor and mental labor in it.
Excellent. So I'll give Sean the last word here. The collection, I believe, comes out on the 1st of March. Yeah, March 1st, in paperback and in ebook. Sean, you can have the last word for the anthology, and then we'll wrap up the interview here.
Yeah, so I definitely encourage folks. I mean, this I think is going to appear on March 25th, right?
Well, that's what. Oh, the show. Yes,
yeah.
That's what March 25th.
Yeah, so by that point it'll been out for 3 or 4 weeks, but I definitely encourage folks to take a look at it. There is a wide diversity of ideas, creativity, and and I think it's the best compilation of authors that I've been able to put together thus far. Even Mike Williamson just mentioned Stephen Barnes. Stephen Barnes has a story in this story. John Mayberry has or in this anthology. John Mayberry has a story in this anthology. John Langan, Laird Barron, obviously. Mike Williamson and Freddie Costello.
Yeah.
T.C. McCarthy, and then there's Martin Shoemaker. Has a really good hard sci-fi story in here. Maurice Broaddus and Rodney Kallstrom has a really good Afrofuturism story. So there's a lot to like in this anthology. Weston Oakes, right, another former another veteran, has a really good story called A Day in the Life of a Suicide Geomancer, right? So there's just stuff that you really want to look at and read because it's interesting. So highly encourage folks to check it. I just put this thing together, but the authors really bring out the creativity and really made the conceits of the anthology, or the central premise of the anthology, work extremely well. And then if you like this, also check out the predecessor anthology, which is Weird World War III, which unfortunately has been kind of turning out to be relatively prescient, given what's kind of the Russian-Ukraine situation. But I'll stop there.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it, and I thought we had a really, really good conversation, and I hope the viewers and listeners get something out of it and pick up the collection and enjoy it. So thank you all.
And now we bring you Timothy Zahn's Cobra. Earth's only hope was the Cobras. The colony worlds Adirondack and Silvern fell to the Troft forces almost without a struggle. Outnumbered and on the defensive, Earth made a desperate decision. It would attack the aliens not from space, but on the ground, with forces the Trofts did not even suspect. Thus were created the Cobras, a guerrilla force whose weapons were surgically implanted, invisible to the unsuspecting eye, yet undeniably deadly. But power brings temptation, and not all the Cobras could be trusted to fight for Earth alone. Johnny Moreau would learn the uses and abuses of his special abilities and what it truly meant to be a Cobra.
Johnny was quiet at dinner that evening. But in the Moreau household, one more or less silent person wasn't enough to change the noise level significantly. 7-year-old Gwen, as usual, dominated the conversation, alternating news of school and friends with questions on every subject, from how weathermen damp out tornadoes to how butchers get the back blades out of a brief hump roast. Jamie, 5 years Johnny's junior, contributed the latest on teenage high school social intrigue, a labyrinth of status and unspoken rules that Jamie was more at home with than Johnny had ever been. Pierce and Irena managed the whole verbal circus with the skill of long practice, answering Gwen's questions with parental patience and generally keeping conversational friction at a minimum. Whether by tacit mutual consent or from lack of interest, no one mentioned the war. Johnny waited until the table was being cleared before dropping in his studiously casual request, "Dadder, can I borrow the car tonight to go into Horizon City?" "What, there isn't another game there this evening, is there?" The other frowned. "No," Johnny said. "I wanted to look at some stuff out there, that's all." "Stuff?" Johnny felt his face growing warm. He didn't want to lie, but he knew that a fully truthful answer would automatically be followed by a family discussion, and he wasn't prepared for a confrontation just yet. "Yeah, just things I want to check out." "Like the Military Command Recruitment Center?" Pierce asked quietly. The background clatter of dishes being moved and stacked cut off abruptly, and in the silence Johnny heard his mother's sharp intake of air. "Johnny?" she asked. He sighed and braced himself for the now inevitable discussion. "I wouldn't have enlisted without talking to all of you first," he said. "I just wanted to go get some information. Procedures, requirements, that sort of thing. Johnny, the war is a long way away, Irena began. I know, Mommer, Johnny interrupted. But there are people dying out there. All the more reason to stay here. Not just soldiers, but civilians, too, he continued doggedly. I just think, well, Dadder said today that there wasn't anything I could do to help. He shifted his attention to Pierce. Maybe not, but maybe I shouldn't give up to statistical generalities quite so quickly. A smile twitched briefly at Pierce's lip without touching the rest of his face. I remember when the full gist of your arguments could be boiled down to because I said so, that's why. Must be college that's doing it, Jamie murmured from the kitchen door. I think they're also teaching him a little about fixing computers in between the argument seminars. Johnny sent a quick frown in his brother's direction, annoyed at the apparent attempt to sidetrack the discussion. But Irena wasn't about to be distracted. What about college, now that we're on that topic? She asked. You've got a year to go before you get your certificate. You'd at least stay that long, wouldn't you? Johnny shook his head. I don't see how I can. A whole year. Look at what the Trofts have done in just 3 months. But your education is important, too. All right, Johnny, Pierce cut off his wife quietly. Go to Horizon City if you'd like and talk to the recruiters. Pierce? Irena turned stunned eyes on him. Pierce shook his head heavily. We can't stand in his way, he told her. Can't you hear how he's talking? He's already 90% decided on this. He's an adult now with the right and responsibility of his own decisions. He shifted his gaze to Johnny. Go see the recruiters, but promise me you'll talk with us again before you make your final decision. Deal? Deal. Johnny nodded, feeling the tension within him draining away. Volunteering to go fight a war was one thing. Scary, but on a remote and almost abstract level. The battle for his family's support had loomed far more terrifyingly before him, with potential costs he hadn't wanted to contemplate. I'll be back in a few hours, he said, taking the keys from his father and heading for the door. The Joint Military Command Recruiting Office had been in the same City Hall office for over 3 decades, and it occurred to Johnny as he approached it that he was likely following the same path his father had taken to his own enlistment some 28 years previously. Then the enemy had been the Menthisti, and Pierce Morrow had fought from the torpedo deck of a Star Force dreadnought. This war was different, though, and while Johnny had always admired the romance of the Star Forces, he had already decided to choose a less glamorous but perhaps more effective position. Army, eh? The recruiter repeated, cocking an eyebrow as she studied Johnny from behind her desk. Excuse my surprise, but we don't get a lot of volunteers for Army service here. Most kids your age would rather fly around in starships or air fighters. Mind if I ask your reasons? Johnny nodded, trying not to let the recruiter's faintly condescending manner get to him. Chances were good it was a standard part of the interview, designed to get a first approximation of the applicant's irritation threshold. It seems to me that if the Troft advance continues to push the Star Forces back, we're going to lose more planets to them. That's going to leave the civilians there pretty much at their mercy, unless the Army already has guerrilla units in place to coordinate resistance. That's the sort of thing I'm hoping to do. The recruiter nodded thoughtfully. So you want to be a guerrilla fighter? I want to help the people, Johnny corrected. Reaching for her terminal, she tapped in Johnny's name and ID code. And as she skimmed the information that printed out, she again cocked an eyebrow. Impressive, she said, without any sarcasm Johnny could hear. Grade Point High School, Grade Point College, Personality Index. You have any interest in officer training? Johnny shrugged. Not that much, but I'll take it if that's where I can do the most good. I don't mind being an ordinary soldier, though, if that's what you're getting at. Her eyes studied his face for a moment. Uh-huh. Well, I'll tell you what, Morrow. Her fingers jabbed buttons, and she swiveled the plate around for his scrutiny. As far as I know, there aren't any specific plans at present to set up guerrilla networks on threatened planets. But if that is done, and I agree it's a reasonable move, then one or more of these special units will probably be spearheading it. Johnny studied the list. Alpha Command, Interorum, Marines, Rangers. Names familiar and highly respected. How do I sign up for one of these? You don't. You sign up for the Army and take a small mountain of tests, and if you show the qualities they want, they'll issue you an invitation. And if not, I'm still in the Army? Provided you don't crusk out of normal basic training, yes. Johnny glanced around the room. The colorful holo-sim posters seemed to leap out at him with their starships, atmosphere fighters, and missile tanks, their green, blue, and black uniforms. Thank you for your time, he told the recruiter, fingering the information mag card he'd been given. I'll be back when I've made up my mind. He expected to return home to a dark house, but found his parents and Jamie waiting quietly for him in the living room. Their discussion lasted long into the night, and when it was over, Johnny had convinced both himself and them of what he had to do. The next evening after dinner, they all drove to Horizon City and watched as Johnny signed the necessary mag forms. So, tomorrow's the big day. Johnny glanced up from his packing to meet his brother's eyes. Jamie, lounging on his bed across the room, was making a reasonably good effort to look calm and relaxed, but his restless fiddling with a corner of the blanket gave away his underlying tension. Yep, Johnny nodded. Horizon City Port, Skylark Lines 407 to Erie, military transport to Asgard. Nothing like travel to give you a real perspective on the universe. Jamie smiled faintly. I hope to get down to New Perseus someday myself. 120 whole kilometers. Any word yet on the tests? Only that my headache's supposed to go away in a couple more hours. The past 3 days had been genuine killers with back-to-back tests running from 7 in the morning to 9 at night. General knowledge, military and political knowledge, psychological, attitudinal, physical, deep physical, biochemical. They'd given him the works. I was told they usually run these tests over a 2-week period, he added, a bit of information he hadn't been given until it was all over. Probably fortunately. I guess the Army's anxious to get new recruits trained and in service. Uh-huh. So, you've said your goodbyes and all? Everything settled there? Johnny tossed a pair of socks into a suitcase and sat down beside it on his bed. Jamie, I'm too tired to play tag around the mountain. What exactly is on your mind? Jamie sighed. Well, to put it bluntly, Elise Karn is kind of upset that you didn't discuss this whole thing with her before you went ahead and did it. Johnny frowned, searching his memory. He hadn't seen Elise since the tests began, of course, but she'd seemed all right the last time they'd been together. Well, if she is, she didn't say anything to me about it. Who'd you find out from? Mona Beale, Jamie said. And of course Elise wouldn't have told you directly. It's too late for you to change things now. So why are you telling me? Because I think you ought to make an effort to go see her tonight, to show that you still care about her before you run off to save the rest of humanity. Something in his brother's voice made Johnny pause, the planned retort dying in his throat. You disapprove of what I'm doing, don't you? He asked quietly. Jamie shook his head. No, not at all. I'm just worried that you're going into this without really understanding what you're getting into. I'm 21 years old, Jamie, and have lived all your life in a medium-sized town on a frontier-class world. Face it, Johnny. You function well enough here, but you're about to tackle 3 unknowns at the same time. Mainstream Dominion society, the Army, and war itself. That's a pretty potent set of opponents. Johnny sighed. Coming from anyone else, words like that would have been grounds for a strong denial. But Jamie had an innate understanding of people that Johnny had long since come to trust. The only alternative to facing unknowns is to stay in this room the rest of my life, he pointed out. I know, and I don't have any great suggestions for you either. Jamie waved helplessly. I guess I just wanted to make sure you at least were leaving here with your eyes open. Yeah. Thanks. Johnny sent his gaze slowly around the room, seeing things that he'd stopped noticing years ago. Now, almost a week after his decision, it was finally starting to sink in that he was leaving all this, possibly forever. You think Elise would like to see me, huh? He asked, bringing his eyes back to Jamie. The other nodded. I'm sure it would make her feel a little better, yeah. Besides which, he hesitated. This may sound silly, but I also think that the more ties you have here in Cedar Lake, the easier it'll be to hold on to your ethics out there. Johnny snorted. You mean out among the decadence of the big worlds? Come on, Jamie. You don't really believe that sophistication implies depravity, do you? Of course not. But someone's bound to try and convince you that depravity implies sophistication. Johnny waved his hands in a gesture of surrender. Okay, that's it. I've warned you before. The point where you start with the aphorisms is the point where I bail out of the discussion. Standing up, he scooped an armful of shirts from the dresser drawer and dumped them beside his suitcase. Here, make yourself useful for a change, huh? Pack these in my cassettes for me, if you don't mind. Sure. Jamie got up and gave Johnny a lopsided smile. Take your time. You'll have plenty of chances to catch up on your sleep on the way to Asgard. Johnny shook his head in mock exasperation. One thing I'm not going to miss about this place is having my own live-in advice service. It wasn't true, of course, but then again, both of them knew that. The farewells at the Horizon City port the next morning were as painful as Johnny had expected them to be, and it was with an almost bittersweet sense of relief that he watched the city fall away beneath the ground-to-orbit shuttle that would take him to the liner waiting above. Never before had he faced such a long separation from family, friends, and home, and as the blue sky outside the viewport gradually faded to black, he wondered if Jamie had been right about too many shocks spaced too closely together. Still, in a way, it seemed almost easier to be changing everything about his life at once, rather than to have to graft smaller pieces onto a structure that wasn't designed for them. An old saying about new wine and old wineskins brushed at his memory. The moral, he remembered, being that a person too set in his ways was unable to accept anything at all that was outside his previous experience. Overhead, the first stars were beginning to appear, and Johnny smiled at the sight. His way of life on Horizon had certainly been comfortable, but at 21 he had no intention of becoming rigidly attached to it. For the first time since enlisting, a wave of exhilaration swept through him. Jamie, stuck at home, could choose to see Johnny's upcoming experiences as uncomfortable shocks if he wanted to, but Johnny was going to treat them instead as high adventure. And with that attitude firmly settled in his mind, he gave his full attention to the viewport, eagerly awaiting his first glimpse of a real starship. Skylark 407 was a commercial liner, the majority of its 300 passengers business professionals and tourists. A handful, though, were new recruits like Johnny, and as the ship made stops over the next few days at Rajput, Zimbabwe, and Blue Haven, that number rapidly went up. By the time they reached Erie, fully a third of the passengers were transferred to the huge military transport orbiting there. Johnny's group was apparently the last batch to arrive, and they were barely aboard before the ship shifted into hyperspace. Someone clearly was in a hurry. For Johnny, the next 5 days were ones of awkward and not totally successful cultural adjustment. Jammed together in communal rooms, with less privacy than even the liner had afforded, the recruits formed a bewildering mosaic of attitudes, habits, and accents, and getting used to all of it proved harder than Johnny had anticipated. Many of the others apparently felt the same way, and within a day of their arrival, Johnny noticed that his former shipmates were following the example of those who'd arrived here earlier and were clumping in small, relatively homogeneous groups. Johnny made a few half-hearted attempts to bridge the social gaps, but eventually he gave up and spent the remainder of the trip with others of the Horizon contingent. The Dominion of Man clearly wasn't nearly as culturally uniform as he'd always believed, and he finally had to console himself with the reasonable expectation that the Army must have figured out how to handle this kind of barrier a long time ago. When they reached the training camps of Asgard, he knew things would change, and they'd all be simply soldiers together. In a way, he was right, but in another way, he was very wrong. The registration foyer was a room as large as the Horizon City concert hall, and it was almost literally packed with people. At the far end, past the dotted line of sergeants at terminals, the slowly moving mass changed abruptly to a roiling stream as the recruits hurried to their assigned orientation meetings. Drifting along, oblivious to the flood passing him on both sides, Johnny frowned down at his own card with a surprise that was edging rapidly into disappointment. Johnny Moreau, Horizon, HN 89927-238-2825P, assigned room AA 315, Frere Complex, Unit Cobras, Unit Orientation C662, Frere Complex, 1530 hours. Cobras. The transport had included a generous selection of military reference material, and Johnny had spent several hours reading all he could about the Army's Special Forces. Nowhere had anything called the Cobras been so much as hinted at. Cobras. What could a unit named after a poisonous earth snake be assigned to do? Decontamination procedures, perhaps? Or else something having to do with anti-personnel mines? Whatever it wasn't likely to live up to the expectations of the past weeks. Someone slammed into his back, nearly knocking the card out of his hand. "Get the fridge out of the road!" a lanky man snarled, pushing past him. Neither the expletive nor the other's accent were familiar. "You want the infaloop? Do it out of the fridging way!" "Sorry," Johnny muttered as the man disappeared into the flow. Gritting his teeth, he sped up, glancing up at the glowing direction indicators lining the walls. Whatever this Cobra unit was, he'd better get going and find the meeting room. The local time clocks were showing 15:12 already, and it was unlikely any Army officer would appreciate tardiness.
That was another installment of Timothy Zahn's Cobra, and that's it for the podcast. Thanks as always to Audible.com and podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. Praise, thanks, and gratitude to Josh Hayes and to Sean Patrick Hazlet and the contributors to Weird World War IV. And good night, Tony Daniel, wherever you are. This is David F. Shireod coming to you from a soundproof bunker somewhere deep in the heart of Texas. Join us here next week at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.